Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this panel on advancing racial equity through infrastructure investments. My name is Elena Beverly. I am an Assistant Vice President for Urban Affairs at the University of Chicago, based here in our Federal Relations Office, and a frequent commentator on MSNBC. And it is my my good friend Christopher just laughed at me, and I am honored to be your moderator for today's important discussion. So we still have a few more people coming in to be seated. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping. There is an app that you can use to check in for this session so that we know who is joining us for this important discussion. Feel free to use social media. You can use @NCRC for attribution, and you can use the hashtag #JustEconomy. I'm going to stop right there and pause for a smile. All right, and that's taken care of. So this conversation is going to be just that, a discussion amongst experts, and then turning it over to you for important questions, because you are our community experts, our community practitioners, and we want to make sure that we get to some answers about where the rubber meets the road. So without further ado, I'll talk to you a little bit about the goals of today's discussion. We are going to be talking about the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and some related policies like the Justice 40 Initiative and the ways that those policies intend to connect communities, enhance health and prosperity, and in doing so, also advance racial equity and reduce racial disparities. We know, everyone in this audience knows, the ways in which the modern day interstate highway system was largely constructed through segregated communities and redline communities of color generally, and the African American community specifically. So we literally had highways that were built through vibrant economic corridors and built through neighborhoods in ways that displaced communities, that disconnected communities, and resulted in a devaluing of assets and disparate investments for generations. Similarly, historic infrastructure investments have also sought communities to connect to regional amenities and left other neighborhoods and communities behind. Moreover, today, BIPOC communities bear the burden of legacy pollution and decrepit water infrastructure, resulting in families of color being far more likely to suffer increased lead exposure in their homes, in their places of business, and in their schools. So we were all thrilled by the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and it ushers in a new era of potential investments in connecting communities, in investing in community health, and in creating jobs. And what we want to do today is talk to you about the contours of that law, the contours of other policies that are related to it, and to explore where there are funding streams and opportunities for communities to engage with these policies to help advance racial equity. I am joined today by a distinguished panel of experts who are helping to execute on these policies and programs. First, I have Christopher Kos, Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at the Department of Transportation, recently Senate confirmed, and we're very proud of him. Second, Karen Detmer, Managing Director of Infrastructure Implementation in the Office of Water at the Environmental Protection Agency. And third, last but not least, Megan Heberly, Senior Director of Policy at NCRC. Now, I'm just introducing them by name and title. You have their bios in your programs, and they have distinguished bios. I'm hoping that they will take a few minutes and go down the line and tell us a little bit about their role, their current position, and their experience, their orientation to this work of connecting infrastructure to racial equity. So Chris, why don't we start with you?
First, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, this is good. I'm coming from a Baptist church, so everyone in the back was responding, so that's good. Again, Christopher Coase, currently the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at the Department of Transportation. That's a lot of words to say. My chief responsibility within the department is to guide our overall policy for the department, which includes helping draft what is now a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package. And in that role, I have the privilege of working with some amazing political and non-career leadership of actually trying to intersect our key priorities as administration, which includes for the department, safety, because safety is our North Star, but also around racial equity, economic performance and competitiveness, climate, as well as recognize that infrastructure itself is transforming for the 21st century. And so bringing that in a way where we can ensure that every individual can live in a thriving, walkable, and inclusive environment is our goal. How did I arrive to this space? I see so many of my familiar friends here who can probably tell you really great stories of how I got here. But one of the things I'll just emphasize, before joining the administration, I served as the vice president of an organization called Smart Growth America, which has served in partnership with a number of you on the ground, which is really bringing the intersectionality of environment, equity, and in the built environment, and how do we ensure we have more thriving communities for all. Prior to that, I also taught at George Washington University and Brookings, but really the whole hope for me was also working with the private sector, recognizing that it's critical to harness not only the public sector capital, but also the private capital to really, truly invest in place, in people to achieve those goals. So again, I'm really appreciative to have the opportunity to talk about some of the work that the Secretary Buttigieg and this administration is doing. And with that, I turn it to my fellow colleagues.
Karen, you want to introduce yourself and your role?
Absolutely. So really tough act to follow there. When Chris mentioned 1.2 trillion, I had to take a step back because I think EPA has long been kind of the little sister of DOT, where he's probably used to talking about trillions of dollars. But EPA, for the first time ever, has $50 billion in water infrastructure funding investment from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Enough to just shut the house down. So we're ecstatic about that. It's not often that the EPA's Office of Water talks about billions of dollars in water infrastructure from the federal government. And I have the pleasure of joining the EPA's Office of Water to oversee the implementation strategy of that $50 billion. And it's really exciting to me, particularly because of the Biden-Harris administration priorities of advancing racial equity throughout the implementation of that funding. So that, coupled with other priorities of climate, advancing climate change, not advancing climate change, advancing and addressing climate impacts. We're really excited about this funding, and we are working fast and furiously to stand up our grant opportunities, as well as push that funding out in a new way through existing programs. So really honored to be accepting that role at the EPA Office of Water. I actually have been at EPA for just under 2 months now, and I came from running the local drinking water utility in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And there, it is, certainly no secret that some of the nation's largest racial disparities exist in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for many of the reasons that Elena and Chris mentioned, as far as redlining and building highways through our neighborhoods that had been thriving in the past. But primarily, what we focused on at our drinking water utility was removing 70,000 lead service line that exist within the city of Milwaukee and Wisconsin. A primary goal. And one of the things, and one of the ways that brought me to the topic of racial equity and inclusion was how we were engaging our neighborhoods, how were we engaging our communities that were hit the hardest by the impacts of adding lead to water. Mm-hmm. And through those exercises, through that looking into, we partnered with a couple of our sister utilities. We looked at how we could engage that community. We partnered with community organizations and wrote the first ever roadmap for advancing racial equity through water infrastructure for the city of Milwaukee. And what we really decided to focus on was workforce development. Making sure, we knew that water equity paired nicely with the ability to have a great family sustaining job. So that was the first and foremost focus that could get us to a place where families were supporting their communities. We were bringing in individuals to make sure that they had access to those jobs, that they knew that those jobs existed, and really just started the work before I got pulled out here to Washington, D.C. But I'm really proud of that work in the communities and the collaborative relationships that were built through that work to understand that the utility really is comprised of community members. And the community members have a certain expertise that the utility needs to rely on as well. So really working externally with community partners, but also better engaging our own workforce to understand that they are a part of the community, and let's engage the community together while building their training capacity. That was just a little bit about my background. I'm a licensed professional engineer in the state of Wisconsin. Really fell into public service. So any chance I get to talk to young engineers, please invite me to your universities, your colleges, your high schools, grade schools. I really love to tout the ability to make an impact in the community through public service. So that's just my little plug there at the end.
Thank you, Karen. And Megan, please introduce yourself and your role and your orientation to the work, which actually precedes even your position here at NCRC.
Yeah, so Megan Haberly, Senior Director of Policy here at NCRC. I've only been on staff here for about 3 months, so this is my first NCRC conference. Really excited to be here and be speaking at the conference today. But I have spent most of my career focused on economic justice policies and equity and infrastructure policies specifically. I come from an advocate's perspective, and specifically, I'm a civil rights lawyer by training, so I sort of came of age to this work back during the former process of economic recovery in around 2009, 2010, when we were seeing the American stimulus package flow out to communities, and there really weren't sort of structures or guardrails in place to make sure that those funds were flowing out in a manner that was equitable, that was even, sort of meeting the basic threshold of compliance often with non-discrimination standards or civil rights standards. There was a lot of focus around, let's get the money out the door, let's get it to flow to shovel-ready projects. And it was the role of the advocates to sort of speak up and talk about the importance of civil rights and making sure that that money was flowing to the communities that were in need. So that was, sort of the stage of my career that opened my eyes to the way that we see these sort of inequities in infrastructure spending, that were created within historical practices generations ago, manifested even today in the present, and the way that federal systems and federal policy systems, aren't necessarily set up in a way that is going to funnel that money where it's needed, such that it's cause for a lot of, deliberate engagement and pushing by the advocacy community as well as from the inside, by policymakers who are, I think what we're seeing in this administration in particular is really historic prioritization of racial equity and that equity mandate in a way that I think was, somewhat frustrating to advocates, 10 years ago, even when policymakers were very well intended, that money sort of wasn't flowing out to where we felt it was the most needed. So a lot of the way that I think about infrastructure and infrastructure policies is contextualized by the body of civil rights laws. And those are laws that were pushed forward by the civil rights movement. People going to the streets, marching, asking for their rights to be vindicated, and asking to make sure that there was a framework in the courts, but also within the government, and policy designs within the government to make sure that we had greater equity in the way that resources were being spent, both when it comes to the distribution of benefits, which is to say new resources that are flowing out, but also when it comes to the burdens that we also see go hand in hand too often with infrastructure spending. So the classic example, of course, is the highways that were built through those African American and other communities of color. But we also see that with many other types of infrastructure, in our country, even into the present day. Another aspect of the thinking that I bring into this is looking at that framework of civil rights laws and thinking about what are the different ways that we can use those tools and sort of the different theories of change that can attach to that set of tools. So litigation, the complaint process is one set, challenging discriminatory practices, making sure that rights are vindicated either in the courts or going to the agencies and having the agencies step in and help in their enforcement roles. Another area is within the policy designs themselves. So that's often referred to as ex-ante measures, making sure that even before those funds flow out the door or you're seeing infrastructure projects go in place, that there are policy designs that have civil rights standards baked into them at the very outset and that are informed by that set of civil rights laws. And then we also see, a movement building aspect outside of that. So where does the community come in? Are those frameworks giving space for community members to lend their voice to the kinds of investments that they want to see, and making sure that there's space in the regulatory framework or the policy framework for those kinds of community interactions. And then the last note that I'll just lift up before turning it back over to our moderator is that I also give a lot of thought to how these issues connect to other issues around civil rights and democracy, and in particular to voting rights and to power at the state and the local level. So some of you may have been in the environmental justice panel earlier today, and folks there were speaking from the vantage point of environmental justice advocates and movement leaders about the role of the states in passing through a lot of these funds that we're seeing flowing out of the federal government, and the fact that these often come into control of sort of more conservative-leaning state governments or in some cases local governments. And so I do a lot of thinking, too, about the way that kind of feeds back into issues of, who are the local electeds answering to? What is the role of sort of local money and resources in shaping those local political conversations that then, in turn, inform the way that these infrastructure dollars are spent? So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Alana.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you so much for that framework, because we're going to come back to that over and over again. What are some of the ex-ante provisions and measures and ways that racial equity is being baked into the policies and the grants and the funding streams that are coming down from the agencies? Chris, I'm going to turn it to you for an overview of that $1.2 trillion and the ways in which the bipartisan infrastructure bill aims to help connect communities and to right some of the historic wrongs. I don't think it's explicitly spelled out in the provisions that this is an aim to right the historical record, but there's a proactive sense of how you are trying to connect communities, particularly communities of color, and advance racial equity. And if you could speak to that.
Certainly. First and foremost, one of the things that's important to center here is we as an administration did not wait for a bipartisan infrastructure law to try to address the historic harms that's happening in the communities. On day one, we've all heard the kind of talking point, the president signed an executive order that around racial equity, but also around environmental justice and general the climate crisis, which actually created the Justice 40 initiative. Through that framework, our secretary literally on this first day coming in, instituted through our office a new equity guidance. And through that actually informed not only through the dollars that we have as OST, but also all the modes that we work with, whether it's Federal Highway, Federal Transit Administration, which basically said a couple things. Number one, we wanted to do a data assessment of how our dollars are actually impacting community and how we can talk about the program design and making them better. Through that, we also then identified some key language that we wanted to see in every discretionary grant that came out over the last year, FY21. Now, taking those two things together, of course, working with our sister agencies, doing that data research, we found that through that process, through that policy framework that incorporated equity and climate in the majority of our discretionary grants, we saw an immediate impact. Most notably, one that should get cheers from both sides of the aisle, is that through the dollars that we were spending just before the bipartisan infrastructure law, we saw a 23% increase in dollars going to rural, tribal, and disadvantaged communities. And I think that from the get-go really set a tone about how we wanted to leverage the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I think you're going to see more agencies actually begin to have those thoughtful discussions as they are learning through their own exercise, as we did early on. Now, with that, those efforts, that data assessment that we all did, really did actually inform the bipartisan infrastructure law. Now, of course, you have the American Jobs Plan that eventually you negotiate with Congress. But one of the things, there are a couple of things that we saw in the infrastructure package that I want to emphasize that really speaks to how are we trying to reconnect communities and address the harms. First and foremost, one of the things that we really work with our colleagues on Capitol Hill, because again, as you know, to make laws requires you to push an agenda, have a North Star, but also build a coalition. And I'll be honest with you, yes, about 70% of all of our dollars that's in part of the 1.2 trillion, but also the 650 billion that comes within the Department of Transportation flows through a formula. And that formula goes directly to state DOTs, to metropolitan organizations, to transit agencies, and in limited cases, directly to cities. Now, people would say that doesn't change the status quo. But a couple of things actually did happen as part of that. So normally folks would yell and say, oh, state DOTs have all the money. Actually, within the program, some equity was incorporated, which actually instruct DOTs now to increase the level of sub-allocation to localities and MPOs, which means advocates, local governments, mayors, business leaders, this is your opportunity to actually engage in the transportation planning process that you otherwise would not have been engaged in, because that's normally a process that would have been held and managed by your state DOT or MPO. This is a new opportunity to organize. The second piece here is we saw significant increases because of what we've been seeing in terms of deaths on roadways. As you know, we released a report that showed nearly 40,000 individuals are dying on our roadways. Disproportionately, that is Black and brown communities. And if you actually take a step back and look through the history of redlining and infrastructure spending, there's a direct correlation. When you look at communities that have high pedestrian impact, are generally places that did not see the necessary investments that actually made it safer for a mother to walk her child to her school, so her child could also then leave school and go to the grocery store to bring back eggs home before the lights come on, right? And that's just speaking from my own lived experience living in a rural town. One of the things the infrastructure bill did was actually create $5 billion dedicated to supporting and reducing local governments' tragic story of roadway fatalities. And from our perspective, we just released this NOFO several months ago, we are looking for communities to actually prioritize equity in that. So it means who's dying the most, where, and how are you going to address it? And this, for the first time, we're actually designing the program where, as part of the infrastructure law, we are prioritizing local governments, more so than state DOTs. The last two things I'll emphasize here is that we can't talk about equity and if we don't talk about access, right? The idea that we are living in an environment where we're dealing with multiple fires. We're dealing with an economic crisis and recovery that's induced by the COVID-19 public health crisis. We have a climate crisis. We have an equity crisis. And we have the crisis of the future of how do we make sure that we as a nation are competitive against our global adversaries. Through that, we're finding that we have to actually bring these things, because they have intersectionality, we have to bring them together. And one of the ways we do that is recognize that people need to have more options to get to places. And that means we need to invest more, not just in the car-dominated society that we've built out, but also in more walkable, biking, and inclusive spaces where if you're disabled, whether you're a child, whether you're a senior citizen, you should be able to live in a thriving community. And if you take a step back, if some of those who are in the real estate community, you know this, places that have multiple options of getting around are rising in costs. So from our perspective, if we are going to compete in the future, address climate, and also center equity, it also means for the first time, we have to invest in expand transit. And that's one of the things that I'm really excited about, is that for the first time, this is the largest investment in public transportation ever, the largest investment in passenger rail ever, which means more communities are going to have the ability to address equity. Now, with that being said, and I'll conclude here, We also recognize that as we have these new leverage, I mean, again, from the Department of Transportation, not only do we see an increase in formula dollars, we also see an increase in our discretionary dollars. Now, recognizing that we have a framework that seems to be successful, we're going to continue to address that. But also recognize that for the first time, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law actually did something that many advocates have been calling out for a long time, which is, yes, we need to acknowledge that some harm has happened. And so for the first time, we're going to be announcing very soon, in the next couple of weeks, a new program called the Reconnecting Communities Program. And the Reconnecting Community Program is intended to do three things. Number one, we recognize, as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, that many communities are now sitting on assets. We talk about highways, as someone coming from rural America, is the railroad lines, right? Living on the other side of the railroad track is a common phrase, right? Infrastructure that are coming at the end of the life cycle for many communities across the country, we recognize that they need capacity, technical assistance capacity and planning dollars to actually ask a simple question. What has happened here? How did we arrive, and how can we move forward? And so we're going to be providing those technical assistance and planning dollars. There are some communities now who have already done that iteration and process of understanding the intersectionality of land use and transportation and the impact on their community, on public health, and have actually designed transportation infrastructure projects or removal of transportation infrastructure projects to actually reconnect their communities. And so we'll be also supplying capital dollars as well. Recognizing that there's only $1 billion, we are also looking to see how we can actually use the other dollars that we have, as our $650 billion, to actually leverage and make Reconnected Communities program be more of a principle. And so to do that, we are looking across all of our discretion to see how we can incentivize those projects and those planning efforts, but also work with state DOTs. And because what you may not know is that state DOTs are seeing the crisis too. And they're asking, how do we engage in this space? And so we're going to use our bully pulpit, our convening power, and hopefully working with you who are on the ground to actually bring those strategies, lift up those voices, but also recognizing that this is a journey that we all have to take together. And if we do that, then the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law years to come will be one that will catalyze more investments in the type of intervention that needs to happen to redress some of the harms that we're seeing in rural and urban communities across the country.
Okay, so Christopher, just to put a fine point on it, this Reconnecting Communities program, it is discretionary funding. It can go in partnership to community members to help participate in this planning and review of the way in which land use and transportation decisions have affected community.
Absolutely, and this is a game changer for us. Traditionally, the Department of Transportation doesn't fund community-based organizations or partnerships with community-based organizations. Normally, we fund DOTs, transit agencies, NPOs. So in this case, community-based organizations are eligible for our funding. We are highly encouraging organizations to partner amongst themselves, because you can imagine there are a lot of community groups in one place, but we're encouraging community groups to partner, also try to partner with philanthropy, other civic organizations, particularly in the private sector, and also your local government. You're generally going to be more competitive that way. In addition to that, we recognize that there are going to be a ton of communities who are not going to be ready.
Yeah.
And so we are, later this year, going to be announcing kind of a community of practice of sort, where community groups and local governments can come together to learn. And so we're going to facilitate that in a separate announcement later this year.
That's so exciting. Incredible. All right, I'm hoping that there'll be lots of questions from this audience about that opportunity, because that is a direct way to engage, and it's hot off the presses. It hasn't even been announced yet.
Exactly.
So I'm feeling good about this panel already.
Tweeting.
We're tweeting out, right? All right, so Karen, that's going to be a tough act to follow, for sure.
We've got announcements.
Oh, they do.
Okay.
They got people
Okay, all
doing it.
right.
They got
So
announcements.
talk to us about the way in which the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is helping to address the lead water crisis and the community wastewater crisis. I mean, most of the national attention has been focused on the Flint water crisis, but we know that there are elevated levels of lead in cities from Newark to New York to Baltimore to here in DC to Detroit, where I'm from. So help us understand how this law will help to address that and makes historic investments in that transformation.
Absolutely. So I mentioned the $50 billion. I just can't say it enough, even though I feel like it's being rubbed in a little bit over here by Chris, but
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. But $15 billion of that is exclusively for lead service line identification and replacement. And I mention identification because a lot of communities are out there, they don't know where their lead service lines are. They don't know how many lead service lines there are. So a good portion of that funding for fiscal year 2022 that has been announced, we have $3 billion going out through similar to DOT through formulas that we work with, and we put that funding out to states, tribes, and territories. A lot of that funding will be used to identify where those lead service lines are and get communities ready to replace those lead service lines. So we are really focused right now on technical assistance. We have a lot of technical assistance funding availability through EPA's set aside that we received from the bill funding. And we also have technical assistance funding that we are regularly using that we put out to states and community partners through our environmental finance centers that we use on an annual basis. And as far as you can see, I oversee bill implementation, I oversee the infrastructure implementation, but we are pulling that money from everywhere that we can to leverage those resources and make sure that communities are well prepared and their community partners are well prepared. I know firsthand that you're not going to get a property owner to sign off on the paperwork when the water utility comes and knocks on the door, right? They're going to say, I don't want to talk to the water utility. What have you done for me lately? And they're going to slam the door. But when you have a community-based organization that comes and knocks on the door and explains and uses their expertise about the neighborhood and explains to that individual, that household, the importance of getting that lead service line replaced and engaging that property owner to understand what their concerns are, a whole world of opportunity opens up, and gathering that community expertise, understanding what the anxieties are associated with getting that lead service line replaced, understanding that for a child care facility, Milwaukee, Wisconsin had or still has an ordinance that all child care facilities are to be operating without a lead service line. So if you apply to have a child care facility in the city of Milwaukee, the water utility will reach out to you, replace the service line at that location free of charge. Fantastic program. But what does that mean to a child care operator if they have to shut down for a day because they don't have water to take care of those kids? So those types of bits and pieces of expertise that we know that our community partners are more willing to talk to, or our community partners are more able to get that information and expertise and information about what those anxieties are for those households, for those child care providers, for those school operators. That is critical. And we need to arm those community organizations. We need to arm the utilities. We need to arm the states with the ability to get all that information together. So we will have an announcement later this summer. And we will be rolling out a lead technical assistance program. And we're still developing it, so I wish that I was a little bit closer, because we really need to focus on getting that technical assistance out, not only to engage and get the identification, to get the inventories put together, but also how does a small or disadvantaged, underserved community put together a grant application to get that funding from the state? The $15 billion that's put out to states from the EPA for states to implement and provide to communities, 49% of that has to be provided to disadvantaged communities through principal forgiveness loans or grants. Free money. And it has to go to disadvantaged communities. So we need to ensure that we're arming disadvantaged communities with the information to apply, with the technical expertise and assistance to apply for that funding, to access that funding. And we are going out full force on that.
49%. Again, 49% of that
49%.
funding must go to communities that are quote-unquote disadvantaged, but that means underserved or historically marginalized communities who have the expertise and the insight and the trust of the communities to be able to carry out this work.
That's right. And we're not a big fan of the word disadvantaged either. That's what's in the statute, so that's what we use. And it's important to note that the states actually define what a disadvantaged community means in their particular state. That is something that the EPA does not have control over. However, we have ability to encourage and incentivize the change of that definition of disadvantaged communities. So we put out in March of this year a Bipartisan Infrastructure Law state revolving fund, which includes that lead service line replacement funding, implementation memo, a lot of words. Just look up water bill implementation memo from March of this year. And in that, we give some information about what states should be looking for in their definition of disadvantaged communities. We have many states that define disadvantaged communities as small communities. We know through engaging those states that they are looking at that. They are evaluating what their definition is of disadvantaged communities, because they know if they're just looking at small communities, they're not going to have any chance of getting this funding actually utilized. Mm-hmm. And they are very interested in utilizing this funding. They want to get the lead out. They want to ensure that they're using this funding. And I'll pivot a little bit from lead because that is very important, a high priority for the EPA. But we have a lot of priorities. So in addition to the lead funding, the funding that's going out in the general state revolving funds for all water infrastructure projects, stormwater, wastewater, clean water, getting wastewater removal systems and treatment systems to communities that don't currently have that, small rural communities, is so essential, and we've seen that firsthand. It is a public health issue, significant public health issue in certain communities. That funding also had, that $22 billion also has a requirement of 49% of it going to disadvantaged communities as principal forgiveness loans, which means you don't have to pay it back, they forgive the principal, or grant funding. This is significant, and we need to ensure that those communities that are defined as disadvantaged by their states are getting access to that, and that the states are utilizing the correct definition of disadvantaged communities to get that money out to the right people that need it the most. I'll also mention we have a significant amount of funding that has been allocated, $10 billion in total, $5 billion included in that state revolving fund allocation, but also $5 billion that we have an announcement coming out tomorrow. Beat you. Just kidding. We have an announcement coming out tomorrow about the emerging contaminants grants for small or disadvantaged communities. And that funding will be accessible to communities for water infrastructure projects related to drinking water to remove and address emerging contaminants, including PFAS, perfluorinated compounds, forever chemicals. So significant amount of investment. That's $5 billion over the 5-year span of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. We're announcing $1 billion going out tomorrow. And we're really looking forward to all the states that have already engaged with us, letting us know that they are interested in getting that funding and getting that funding out to communities that need it most. Again, that's for small and disadvantaged communities to address emerging contaminants, including PFAS or forever chemicals. So really excited about that as well.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm tempted to test the audience, but I'm not going to do that to you.
We can talk a lot.
I'm tempted to test because I have identified from this discussion thus far 3 grant opportunities that can go directly to community that can help to create jobs, right? So first, I heard the Reconnecting Communities planning. I heard the lead service line identification. I heard the wastewater programs and emerging contaminants grants. I think I might have missed one from Christopher, but he's going to reiterate that. Is there anything, are there any other programs or opportunities that you would want to identify or overarching themes that you would want to raise, either Christopher or Karen, about the way the bipartisan infrastructure law is creating jobs? And not just any jobs, creating jobs for those who have been historically marginalized. Because as Karen mentioned, I believe, in her opening remarks, she talked about how during the Recovery Act and in the rescue plan, there was an emphasis on shovel-ready. And those shovel-ready jobs tend not to go to contractors of color. They tend not to go to community organizations of color. And so I'm wondering how, we talked about the 49%, we talked about the interest in racial equity. Are there other avenues for job creation that you want to emphasize that are going to communities of color?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Three things, and I did miss you this one on my list, but three things I want to highlight. We all know that a bipartisan infrastructure law, when we invest in infrastructure, it creates jobs. We don't need to do the economics around that. We know that. The question is, are we building a workforce for these transportation jobs that actually reflect the communities upon which we're investing in? Point one. Two, are we actually creating the infrastructure jobs and preparing communities for the innovation that is actually happening right now? And then three, to the extent that we are actually enhancing and building the ecosystem for the industry that we have now to be prepared to deliver that. So let me take each of those. And I recognize that I do have to, I'm going to keep my comments short because I do have to have a call with the Secretary momentarily. But I will definitely hopefully facilitate some Q&A if possible.
Okay, great.
So number one, we, as part of the Justice 40 framework, we have to identify key programs that we want to deliver 40%, not just investments, but benefits to disadvantaged communities.
Okay, 40% of the benefits of federal investments in climate and clean energy, including sustainable transportation.
Exactly.
That's Justice 40. Go ahead.
And so from that standpoint, one of the most premier and marquee programs within the Department of Transportation that literally touches upon a number of those key points we talked about earlier is our rollout of the 500,000 electrical charging stations across the country. We are literally supercharging an entire new marketplace, supercharging and building a new infrastructure platform that our kids, our grandkids are going to look at us and say, did you do this right? Just last week, we announced our 180-day guidance for our NEVI formula program and eventually launching our discretionary grant. Why is that important? Right now, state DOTs are sitting on $7.5 billion. They've been waiting for us to tell them how the heck do they need to spend it. One key aspect of that guidance, as well as the 90-day guidance that we gave several weeks ago, really emphasized one key point that, Elena, you're touching on, which is we are, as each state has to actually issue what is called a state plan of how they're going to execute. One of the things we're asking them to tell us, how are you engaging underserved, overburdened communities, key stakeholders in their eco space, whether it's HBCUs, whether it's small business, disadvantaged business enterprises, who can actually do the following: build the darn things, right? Locate them, make sure they have maintenance, and also how are you intersecting that with the other community groups to ensure that the placement of these important infrastructure is actually providing community benefit. Now, those state plans are going to be public. Those state plans are going to have to be engaged, state DOTs are going to have to go to those communities. And what Justice 40 actually afford a lot of us to do as agencies is to publicly say, and we had to do this in partnership with the Department of Energy, we basically said to the states, here are the communities that we want you to prioritize. Now, for you as advocates, those who are in the community development space, I'm asking you, if you're on that map, activate, because we are looking for you to be present in those state plans as we review them. So that's one key place that we're tracking. And of course, we're going to be tracking jobs and workforce performance. But of course, this is also an opportunity for us to engage our labor colleagues, right? Because they are a key aspect and key instrument in making sure that we meet our promise that the president has made. The last two things I'll just emphasize here is that Department of Transportation recognizes we can't do this alone. We are we give money out. We don't build bridges, we don't build trains. We have to give and we work in partnership with partners. But one of the things we also recognize is that we can't just leave the workforce in the industry alone. And so one of the things I'm just really excited about my colleague, Paige Shevlin, who we brought in recently as our strategic advisor on workforce development. She is literally have created a new MOU between the Department of Transportation and the Department of Labor, and where we are actually working side by side in identifying what technical assistance dollars are needed and where. Is it on the grant making side? Is it on the workforce development side? And if so, how do we deliver that out? And I think that's more is going to be stated on that very soon. But working hand in glove or hand in hand with the Department of Labor, leveraging their technical skills that can actually go to community-based organization is going to be phenomenal and huge. The last thing I'll say here in terms of how we're driving workforce is the fact that within the Department of Transportation, just like some of our sister agencies, we issued a equity action plan. A key aspect and one key pillar of our equity agenda is around wealth creation. Mm-hmm. And in order for us to go, yes, that's right. In order for us to, serve in the bullet pulpit with our secretary, where we're saying we want to drive these dollars to the communities that have been underserved, underburdened, but also lifting all boats, we recognize we got to walk the walk and talk the talk. And as such, we have committed to ourselves that we are going to increase our disadvantage in small business utilization. Right now, we're hovering about 18% as of last 2 fiscal years. Just this fiscal year, we said, you know what, we're going to be ambitious. We're going to go to 20%. With the idea that by 2022, we hopefully get up to 22 to 25%. And right now, we're getting pretty darn close to meeting that mark by the end of this fiscal year. So again, we are working with Shelby Scales, who many of you know, who is managing our office for small business utilization. She's partnering with HBCUs, with local CDFIs, to use her resources, whether it's loans, whether it's some technical assistance grants, and leveraging her dollars with SBA to, again, build that ecosystem that can actually be ready to not only receive these dollars, but also lead the future on the innovation that will subsequently come.
That was excellent. Okay, thank you. Karen, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely, and I'll add another grant opportunity to it as well.
You get a
We
grant.
have the money
You
for
get
that.
a grant. You
I
get a
love
grant.
We just can't get it out fast enough. So, similarly, we are a funding agency. We can't do it alone. We don't train the workforce, but we can empower states and communities to train the workforce, to get the workforce that's needed. And technical assistance is a huge part of that. So we have technical assistance that we're putting out to communities to make sure that people are aware of these opportunities, that contracting is being done in compliance with, minority business enterprises, disadvantaged business enterprises. A lot of communities have small business enterprise goals and requirements that they are moving forward. And so we're pushing that information out. We're pushing that information forward. Also engaging with states in what other technical assistance do you need? Community, what are you hearing from your communities? What technical assistance are you seeing a need for in your community, and how can we help and get that information out so that we can best prepare everybody to get the funding spent, to get it into the communities that need it the most, and we'll see the largest impact and the largest benefits from it. And one opportunity, the grant opportunity that I mentioned, is actually not part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Congress afforded us for the past 3 years a water workforce grant opportunity. Not a whole lot of dollars there, not in the billions, in the low millions, but still really an exciting opportunity for communities to come together, partner with water utilities, partner with universities, and come up with an innovative water workforce approach to train those individuals that are looking for great family supporting jobs and get them to work for water. So we've had 2022 is our third funding year. We should have an announcement coming out soon about that grant opportunity. We have just funded I think it was 10 different programs. But we received one thing that was so exciting about the first round of applicants that we saw come through, we received 60 different applicants. 52 of them were eligible applicants. That is so exciting. And that shows what need is out there for this water workforce planning and training opportunity, workforce development opportunity. So we're so excited that Congress has continued to fund it. When I mentioned, it's not bill funded, this is the type of opportunity that we're looking for. We're pulling out every single resource that we have and utilizing the bill priorities that Congress has put out there, that the Biden administration is moving forward to ensure that the funding is meeting those Justice 40 goals and we're really tracking higher than 40%. EPA has long been a proponent of environmental justice, and we're just ecstatic that we have the resources to move forward environmental justice in general. And that, of course, includes racial equity and inclusion, making sure that we're getting people to jobs, making sure that we're righting those historic wrongs. So really excited about that. So watch out for that water workforce opportunity. We will have an announcement coming up later this year, but really excited about how we're seeing that need come in and that ask come in much more than the funding, because then we can go back and say, look at the need that's out there. Let's get more dollars to this program. And I'm so excited about when we start showing some successes out of that program. The bottom line is the money is there. Vice President Kamala Harris was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I keep bringing up Milwaukee. It's like I never left. Was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin back in January. And she highlighted to the labor community that the need is there. The money is there. Come get the jobs. And really, put them to task to say, we're going to hire people, we're going to train people up. This is 5 years. This is not 1 year of funding towards lead service line replacements, which many utilities have had to deal with. Just year by year trying to get the funding in place. Contractors aren't going to build up their workforce for a 1 year opportunity. But when they see the amount of investment that the EPA is putting out over the next 5 years, they are going to grab people, train people. They're going to be making that investment in the communities, and we're going to be giving them the tools and resources to make that happen.
We're going to pause for a second for some housekeeping here. Christopher, do you need to step away and come back? How much time do you have left with us? I know you need to leave for the
I have 9 minutes.
9 minutes. Okay, that's enough time for Megan to speak to the importance of the political landscape related to this work. What we saw in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was part of a two-part agenda, and it was an investment in sort of the bricks and mortar hardcore infrastructure with the emphasis on Build Back Better investments in human capital and human infrastructure that languished in the Senate. So if you could speak to a little bit what's missing, what didn't we get, what would it have meant for economic opportunity?
Yeah, and I'll start by saying that I want to acknowledge that the Infrastructure Act is momentous historic levels of investment. So very exciting to see that package. That package did get passed, and it includes funding, for water resources, transportation resources, as we've heard, as well as for broadband and other kinds of environmental resources around cleanup, energy investments, et cetera. That said, a lot of that work does remain to be done. So for example, the Build Back Better Act contained historic levels of funding for affordable housing, for rental programs, for resources for public housing to fix it up, make it healthier, and broaden the amount of affordable housing that was available for people, as well as a suite of other funding packages that didn't manage to make it through the Senate. So advocates are continuing to push for those things and lift them up, even as we are focusing on the implementation of the infrastructure package at the same time, because we do see those programs that didn't get funded as being equally critical to serving our communities. The other thing that I would say about the infrastructure package is that, in part because it is bipartisan, it didn't have what I think a lot of advocates would have said was an ideal amount of pointing towards equity outcomes or equity directives that were actually within the legislative text of that bill. So there's a lot of potential around the funding that is in that legislation and that was funded, but it's really being left to the agencies to implement that, to come up with the program designs that are going to make sure that that money gets where we want it to go and is spent in the ways that we want it to. And that also that harm isn't done that mirrors some of those historical harms in the past. So very fortunately, as you've heard, they have an arsenal of tools at their disposal. They're competitive grant programs where they have a lot of discretion to identify, what kind of projects are going to be competitive at the local or state level in order to be awarded funding. They have enforcement arms to engage in civil rights oversight. They have technical assistance resources, and of course the stakeholder engagement efforts that we're seeing within the administration now, all of which are incredibly important tools to make sure that this money is spent the way that we want it to be spent. That said, there are pre-existing challenges, right? Because we are working often within existing program design. So a lot of the transportation programs that were funded were pre-existing programs, and DOT is stepping in and reshaping those. But there's some existing challenges there. So one is that enforcement resources within the federal government have been severely depleted over the years. And so, one thing that we've seen in these legislative packages is more resources for enforcement within those agencies. They're all charged with enforcing civil rights laws, making sure that these programs comply with civil rights directives, but often they just haven't had the personnel to be able to do that, or they've had to make really hard decisions around enforcement priorities. So, we'll bring in complaints around sort of particular circumstances of individual discrimination, but maybe that means we don't have the resources to engage in systemic oversight and really push for systems change at the state or local level. So really hard decisions within those oversight structures when you have a lack of resources. And so it's been great to see that there are additional resources that are there within the budgeting process that are starting to flow out the door. Another challenge is that a lot of these programs are designed with a lot of state or local discretion or as block grants. And so this was actually a policy shift that we saw in many arenas under Reagan, sort of in the 80s. A lot of social programs were eliminated, but then a lot of other programs were converted from programs that served really specific social policies to these block grants. So there's a lot of talk around local control or federalism and state control. But what that really has translated to in practice is that often that money is still flowing to the people who are most financially and politically empowered within those communities, rather than having really specific requirements attached to it as far as flowing to the people who are the most in need. So as you're hearing, the agencies are doing a lot of work to sort of rewire the way that those programs work. But it's a big lift, and that cuts across a lot of different agencies. And capacity varies among the agencies, so it's a varying level of challenge, I would say, from agency to agency.
So what I'm hearing, Megan, though, is that that's an opportunity for advocacy. Mm-hmm. When we know that there are these big budget items that are coming down the pike, this is an opportunity for organizations to conduct their Hill Days and lobby for more specific and targeted funding streams for the communities that we care about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to think that, I think often engagement with civil rights laws and enforcement is something that people have encountered with a degree of cynicism because it hasn't necessarily been working the way that it's designed to and the way that it should. But now I think we are seeing sort of a new momentum there and a re-energizing and a reinvestment. And so I'd certainly encourage people in communities to think about, how can you play that sort of constructive role from the outside, either by going to, community engagement platforms, meetings, or sometimes by, bringing litigation, or filing a complaint. And that's a way to document a problem, bring it to the agency's attention. And the federal agencies have a role to engage then and say, this problem has been brought to us, it's been documented, it's part of our role, as the entity that is bringing these civil rights to fruition, to go in and actually investigate that situation on the ground and make that right, actually come into being.
Wonderful. Okay, so I have additional questions. Most of them I'll just flag for my panel are related to the equity action plans and carrying out the executive order. I have some questions related to which tools the audience can most easily access to get more information. But I want to flag for the audience members, we're about to hit Q&A. So if you have questions, will you please stand up, stand in line in a socially distanced fashion, so maybe a couple feet behind the person in front of you. Before we take our first question, and I'm going to start with my senior saint over in the corner, who I understand is not going to go to the microphone. But before we get to our first question, I want to ask Christopher, if you need to step out, do. Before you step out, let us know what's the one resource that you want the audience to leave with. Is there a website? Is there something they should be following?
Absolutely. For our department, we are tracking all of our bill announcements, availability of resources, as well as our new initiatives on our website. So go to www.transportation.gov/bill, B-I-L. But just to go to our website, and we a whole host of resources. Also, just note that we will be launching what is called the Thriving Communities Initiative, which is to support capacity builders in our 10 major regions, to actually identify nonprofits, both large, small, to provide direct capacity to these communities. For us, we want to have a new pipeline at the end of this infrastructure timeline that when we go back to Congress and ask for another reauthorization, we can show that not only are there needed projects, but there are actually capacity to deliver them. So definitely call you to those. And so again, thank you for the opportunity again, dear friend, and to all my friends here. We love to stand in partnership with all of you as we move this forward.
Thank you so much. Let's give him a round of applause. Okay, and now we can take our first question. The beautiful young lady in blue, if you could please say your name, where you're from.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Ramona Taylor Williams, and I hail from the mighty Mississippi. I wanted to ask some questions for Christopher, but I'm going to get his direct contact information, and I'm going to contact him directly.
All right.
As I stated, I am from Mississippi. I live in Jackson, Mississippi, and we have major issues around water and lead in our water. In fact, Jackson is under a long time consent decree. Unfortunately, we are having some issues getting resources into our communities in order to abate the lead in our lines. I'm also concerned about the WIN program and how it appears that Mississippi State University, who I partner with, I ain't got no problem with that. They have the WIN funding, but I'm concerned that HBCUs are not being involved and they are not getting their fair share of these funding, of these funds that millions of dollars of funds. I'm a great-grandmother. My great-grandson is going to be paying back this money. And I want to make sure that he has a benefit, a return on the investment that I make, on the investment that he is going to ultimately make. We got issues in Mississippi. And let me give you a for instance real quick, and I know I don't want to take up everybody's time, but I have to take advantage of the opportunities that are here. Senator Wicker, he appointed, and he got. Okay, Senator Wicker, he earmarked, and I know they say we don't have earmarks anymore, but we do.
Oh, we do.
He earmarked for water and sewer. Oh, Lord. I'm sorry. He earmarked for water and sewer funding of $13.6 million for the town of Clinton, which is majority white. $10 million for Meridian. $10 million for Oxford. $10 million for Rankin County. And $10 million for Madison County, which is now the most wealthiest county in the state of Mississippi. $0 for the city of Jackson. We need to do something about this. We need to do something about this. If we're going to, we can't just let equity be a generic word like Pampers and Vaseline. We got to make equity mean equity. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I would love to follow up with you to hear a little bit more about some of the issues specific to Jackson, because that's part of the reason why I'm here, is to make sure that we are engaging directly with our community partners and hearing where those needs are. We do, as I mentioned, we have a technical assistance program that we'll be announcing probably early fall, late summer, on lead service line inventories, identification and replacement. We also have a technical assistance pilot that will be moving out related to closing the wastewater access gap, because we know that wastewater in rural communities is very difficult, as well, as I had mentioned earlier. We're also piloting a program where we'll have teams come into certain communities and just gather an understanding of where those technical assistance needs are and where the need is the greatest, so that we can identify the resources and get those resources to the communities in a quick manner. Finally, I'll mention, we do have new requests for applications that are out for environmental finance centers and for accessing some of those technical assistance opportunities and the grant funding for some of our more traditional programs, but also adding the bill funding in there. So we have a lot of resources, and I would love to hear more.
Thank you. Thank you for your question and for your powerful testimony. It's so important. I hope you all can connect after the panel. And for our next member of the audience, please introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, what organization you represent.
Sure. Hi, I'm Oscar Perriobello. I'm the economic justice reporter at Next City. I really wish Christopher was here for this question, but maybe you can speak to this at the EPA. Did I miss something? Maybe I missed something, but I thought someone would bring up the local hiring ban here. Do folks on this side of the microphone, does everyone here know about the local hiring ban? Did something happen to it that I didn't know about? Because as far as I know, it's still mostly in place, even though the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law partially repealed it, but I think it's still mostly in place. And if we're talking about investing some of these dollars in the communities we're talking about, the local hiring ban still seems to be something that maybe we need to talk about more, or maybe I missed something.
I'm not familiar with it. Maybe Secretary Coase would be familiar with it. And when you mean
Yeah.
the local hiring ban, you mean local hiring ban as it applies to the District of Columbia?
No, this is a federal infrastructure spending ban on local hiring preferences for federally supported infrastructure projects. It was created under Reagan in the 80s.
I'm not familiar. I don't know if Megan or Karen, are you able to speak to this at all?
So I certainly, I'm not as well-versed in this as I am in water infrastructure issues, but I know that that is a concern with many local communities, and this is kind of going back to when I was in Milwaukee, just a very lengthy 2 months ago. I was actually serving as the interim commissioner of public works for the city of Milwaukee, and so this came up under a transportation issue as well as a water infrastructure issue. And the issue primarily is that, and this came up particularly for ARPA funding that was going out to communities, and communities were forced to rebid programs and projects that were already underway because the local preferences, Milwaukee in particular had what was called an RPP, the Residential Preference Program, that put goals on publicly funded projects to hire within certain zip codes.
Yeah.
And the federal funding doesn't allow for that, much
Yeah.
like the federal funding doesn't allow for the local definition that many communities have of small business enterprises that put a geographic requirement on it. I don't know enough to be able to speak on where that's
Yeah.
at, but just for the education of the community, I do know that local officials and local attorneys are closely tracking this, and it was my understanding that there were some opportunities to move that funding forward, particularly for ARPA. I'm not sure how it relates to the bill, but I would presume that it would be similar, to move that funding forward with some of those local preferences, as long as they were more stringent than the federal requirements rather than less.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
But
though.
I
Yeah.
certainly, do your research on it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I can't speak to that question directly either, but I would note, to the question of, how can we foster better hiring practices that promote equity? Some of the other initiatives that were within the Build Back Better Act and unfortunately didn't move forward regarded recruitment, outreach, training for people that had been in contact with the criminal justice system, as well as outreach to foster youth, as well as recruitment pipelines to historically Black colleges and universities. So I think it is, it's an important issue. It merits creative thinking and certainly some policy reforms as well.
Thank you for that. And for the next member of our audience, we have about 15 minutes left, ladies and gentlemen. So if you have questions, please feel free to raise them. And if not, I have a few for the panelists as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
We call them federal crosscutters.
Hi, good
Sir.
afternoon. I'm Bob Zdenek, and actually I'm former Director of Special Initiatives at NCRC, but I'm back in California, and I'm working with two rural coalitions, San Joaquin Valley Housing Collaborative, which I'm interim director, and California Coalition for Rural Housing. And I want to talk to you, Karen, about water and drought. We have over 1 million people in California that do not have water, no access to fresh water, and a number of them are farm workers, because our work's mostly in the San Joaquin Valley, which is where the majority of farm workers. And also we're seeing with drought, people are losing water wells, and then they're getting contaminants. It's a huge crisis. And then we have small towns that have zero. I mean, Fresno has a lot of capacity, but some of the small towns have zip. And so it's really becoming a crisis, and it's growing with the drought and the water issues throughout California and part of the West, but notably in the San Joaquin Valley. And so what types of strategies? I mean, you have these funding opportunities, but hopefully we can start targeting some of them towards some of these communities that have no water.
Yeah, so, and you're obviously very well versed in this, so you're likely very much aware that the Vice President Kamala Harris recently visited California to roll out the plan to discuss and address the resiliency within our water systems, particularly in the West. And our office is working very closely with the White House on that plan and looking at strategies on how we can address this very important issue. I will say, the bill funding that has been put out, there are some opportunities, there are some synergies there where that clean water SRF funding can be put as a resource. Certainly, I discussed the emerging contaminants funding that was included in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So there are some synergies and some opportunities that I think are very much in alignment of addressing the drought conditions and that ongoing climate impacts. Overall, addressing climate impacts is an overarching theme in all of our funding, and looking at making sure that states and encouraging states to fund projects that have those very important priorities is one thing that we're focusing on. But I think there'll be more to come with those strategies coming out.
Great, because I did the climate change workshop yesterday. But I think if we could be in conversation, because we have a couple really key, I don't want to belabor it, we have a couple key networks, and there's some unique issues that we're dealing with around water, some really good solutions, but capacity and resources.
Yeah. Technical assistance is going to be the game changer.
I have another question for the panelists as we have another member of our audience walking to the mic.
We conclude at 3:15.
Oh, no, I thought we
The
went
next
to,
session starts at 3:30.
my apologies.
Yeah,
I
no,
thought
it's
we
fine.
went to 3:30. My sincere apologies.
Yours.
Really quickly, let's
Yeah,
ask
it's
this
quick,
one
it's
last
quick.
question.
Earlier, Karen, you and Chris were talking about the programs. They're going to be funded discretionary monies. You used the word, it wasn't disadvantaged. Do you remember what was the word, communities?
It was disadvantaged.
It was disadvantaged. How are y'all going to define that for the communities? That's my question. How do you define that?
Yeah, so I want to separate two things a little bit, because I know Chris was talking about discretionary funds. We have some discretionary funds, but they're not necessarily associated. I want to pull that apart from the definition of disadvantaged communities. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more about disadvantaged communities and definitions. Per the Safe Drinking Water Act, states are obligated to set the definition of disadvantaged communities. We know that some states have inadequate definitions of disadvantaged communities. So part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law state Revolving Fund implementation memo that we put out in March that I mentioned addresses that and gives states some of the ideas that they should be prioritizing, medium household income, for example, to better define disadvantaged communities. It also encourages states to kind of look at their definition of community. So if there is a water infrastructure program that is going to a city that has not historically fallen into the definition of disadvantaged communities, because maybe some members of that city are more well off than other members, or it's a size issue where the state's definition of disadvantaged community is really just small communities because of an affordability criteria. We're encouraging states to look at, if there's a water infrastructure project that focuses on a portion, a disadvantaged community portion of a larger community, then they should consider that to be fundable under that 49% principal forgiveness and grant opportunity. The other thing that I'll add to that is we have a report coming out very soon here that analyzes all the states' definitions of disadvantaged communities and really lays it out nicely of where states are at currently, because we wanted that baseline so that as we go through fiscal year 2022, and I have a staff member, Wendy Wilkes, she's super smart and
Karen, we got it.
yeah. Oh, sorry. I can talk. So we're also looking at those intended use plans when they come into the states and they are talking about what their definition is, to ensure that there is progress, so that we can identify where those needs are, better engage those states that aren't changing their definition.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for committing the sin of running over in a forum. I'm super embarrassed, but I'm grateful for your participation. Appreciate you and grateful for your participation. Please sign on to the app and evaluate this session. If you feel like it provided some helpful information, important information, please let our hosts know. And thank you again for coming to the panel.